backdrop, Judy.
My background, my fancy background.
That's nice.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MetalCon Live. It's great to have you with us today. I'm Judy Geller, Director of MetalCon, and I'm here with Kaylin Burke at the controls. It's hard to believe that MetalCon is just over 8 weeks away. We couldn't be more excited to safely bring the community back together in what's actually going to be the first time in 2 years. This year, in addition to more than 175 exhibitors, 40 sessions of accredited education, all conveniently on the show floor, we are introducing 3 new pavilions, all focused on providing a wealth of new information, inspiration, and ideas to help you grow your business. There's the new Solar Center, sponsored by S5, the IMP Pavilion, sponsored by the IMP Alliance, and that features 6 major brands all in one place for the first time ever. There's Contact, our construction technology pavilion, and the Architect's Experience, a brand new show within a show for architects, specifiers, and engineers. If you register before August 27th, you can save $25 on your MetalCon registration. And to learn more about all of these great things I just shared with you, just go to metalcon.com and you can check it out in more detail. In the meantime, today we bring you Condensation, the why and how to avoid it. It's presented by Todd Miller of AIA Industries. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Metal Construction Association. MCA members get many benefits, including a special discount on their MetalCon booth. You can contact Jeff Irwin. His contact information is on the slide that Kaylin has up on the screen here for details. And by the way, let me just mention, you can meet Todd in person at MetalCon. He'll be presenting a session in Tampa. Finally, be sure to mark your calendar for August 11th. The next MetalCon Live presents the metal building industry, setting the bar with AC 472 and AC 478, a really important topic. And now my final reminder, if you need technical help, please reach out to MetalCon support in the chat box. And don't forget to complete the post-webinar survey to earn your AIA, HSWs, and LUs for today's session. And now, over to Todd.
Thanks so much, Judy and Kaylin. Great to be here today. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I certainly am very much looking forward to being at MetalCon October 6th through 8th in Tampa, and looking forward to getting back together and seeing people I know and all that type of good stuff. So I want to give a shout out today actually to another great member of our industry, Best Buy Metals of Cleveland, Tennessee. And the reason I'm giving a shout out is I'm actually in their offices today. So I had the opportunity to come down and spend some time with them, and said, hey, can I use your office a little bit for MetalCon Live? And they were very accommodating. So thank you very much. And I know that they will be at MetalCon as well. In fact, their COO, Adam Clark, is going to be one of the speakers at MetalCon also. So look forward to covering today condensation, the why and how to avoid it. I'm going to pop it up here on the screen here. So hopefully everyone can see that okay. I do encourage you, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box and ask questions. I will, if I see one pop up that I can address on the fly, I will do that. Otherwise, I'll catch them at the end. And of course, folks are always welcome to reach out to me as well. So kind of interesting, I was thinking about this, you know, condensation is kind of a big topic that has followed our industry for a lot. In fact, I think the first time I ever spoke at MetalCon was on the topic of condensation. I was there with another industry member, Al Reed, And we spoke on condensation. That was probably 20 years ago, I suppose, or maybe not quite that, but quite a while ago. So reality is condensation is still a topic. It's still a question. It's still a concern, something to be thought of as you approach adding metal roofs or metal wall panels to structures. And I'm going to kind of cover things to think about today. When we actually talk about this more at MetalCon in October, I'll even be going more in depth than I am today on this topic. But look forward to covering a lot. And again, I encourage you to ask questions whenever you have them, and we'll get them covered. So thanks again. Here's the big question, I think. Why should contractors, architects, specifiers, property owners, why should any of us be concerned about condensation? Well, I think, the number one real reason really is health. Condensation obviously is the big supporter, the catalyst oftentimes in buildings that leads to mold and mildew and other types of biological growth. So as a contractor, as an architect, you certainly want to do the right thing for your customers and also for their properties in terms of helping them to avoid condensation and the bad effects of condensation in buildings. And of course, here in the photo on the screen, you see a attic that where the underside of the decking has pretty much completely gotten covered with mold and mildew as a result of condensation. According to the Center for Disease Control, mold can cause a variety of ill health effects, including normal, what we would call allergic responses, runny eyes, stuffy nose, red, itchy eyes, wheezing. And that stuff's annoying enough, but for some folks, molds really can be a trigger of much more severe allergies. They can even be debilitating. And you can certainly have as well an exacerbation of typical problems that some folks have, such as asthma or various types of allergies. So, we get this mold in our buildings sometimes, and here we are out there trying to get rid of it. Currently, and I think this is a 2019 number, mold remediation was a $210 billion industry and growing. And when you look at just residential mold remediation, taking care of mold in a typical house, average cost for that can easily run $5,000 to $10,000 for a house. Sometimes can be even more in particularly difficult or bad situations. So I remember back when mold litigation first came on, and some of us still remember, I think 60 Minutes had done an episode on a house down in Florida that due to some poor building practices had filled up with mold, and folks lost their house, had to be torn down and all that type of stuff. And that was really kind of the kickoff of where we started seeing a lot of mold litigation. So it's been called the asbestos of the 2000s. Those of us remember the asbestos lawsuits of the 80s and 90s. Mold is considered to be that only in the 2000s. And, literally billions of dollars of settlements each year on mold litigation. Contractors, of course, architects, specifiers, designers, oftentimes being caught up in that. So, the way I look at it, though, for a contractor, understanding condensation can really be your competitive advantage, because a lot of contractors are not talking about it. And oftentimes, it's because they prefer to ignore it. Maybe they don't fully understand it. Probably worse than the ones who simply don't talk about it are the ones who are giving misinformation. So that certainly isn't very helpful as well. But you as a contractor, if you can establish yourself as an expert who cares about your clients, cares about their properties, then you really can make condensation, mold, you can put it to your competitive advantage. So you can reduce your future liability on buildings by making sure that your buildings aren't going to support condensation and mold. And you can also, by helping property owners understand the mold risks that they may face and perhaps some things that they can do to minimize those risks, you can actually, make this a new profit center for your business as well. So someone just asked a question: how can ventilation play a role in mitigating condensation buildup, specifically through natural ventilation methods? Certainly ventilation is a key, perhaps the key in most cases, to avoiding condensation. And we are going to dig into that question more in depth here as the presentation goes along. So I assure you, sit tight. We're going to cover that and a whole lot more. So basics of condensation. I always imagine that glass of your favorite cold beverage of choice, lemonade, iced tea, whatever it is, that you take out of your house and you take outside on that warm, sultry day. Believe me, today here in Tennessee is a day when this would happen. But almost immediately when you take that glass outside, you get this condensation droplets on the outside of the glass. And so that really, in basic terms, is what condensation is. It's warm air. When it hits a cool surface, dew point is reached. And as that warm air quickly cools, it ends up losing its ability to hold moisture, and that's how condensation droplets form. So that's just kind of the basics of, what condensation is and how it's created. But so a question is, I remember when we spoke at when Al Reed and I spoke at about condensation at MetalCon years ago, we spent a lot of time on this question. I'm going to spend a little bit on it today, but the question is, why is condensation more of a concern in structures now than it was in the past? And I remember when I was growing up in a house in the 60s and 70s, we didn't really deal with condensation issues, and it really wasn't a concern. We didn't really have mold or mildew in our home. So the question is, why do we today? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. And first of all, I think the important thing to understand is that condensation is not the result of moisture that originates outside in the ambient atmosphere, but condensation in building science is condensation that results from moisture that originates in the living space. And so, we do a lot of things in our homes and other buildings today that generate moisture. And that can be very simple things like laundry and cooking and bathing, ventless gas stoves that have become popular, put off a lot of moisture as well. So we do all these things. I mean, if you think back, and believe it, this even predates me, but 80 years ago, houses didn't have indoor plumbing. And so, you didn't have near as much moisture inside of a home. But today we tend to have more, and house plants. I remember being in a house once that had a very unique form of horticultural operation going on inside the home. And they were having a lot of condensation issues and asking me why. And anyway, I can tell you that whole story a different day. But another thing that has happened is we've made our houses so much tighter. And that's all been done out of a quest for energy savings in our homes. So we have tighter windows, tighter doors. We put house wraps on our homes, which have some degree of breathability, but they are still a barrier. They don't breathe as much as if there wasn't any house wrap. Sometimes we'll put fan fold on the outside of homes. We've done all these things to make the houses more weather tight and also more energy efficient. And what that means is that this moisture, so moisture that we originate inside of our structures wants to drive to drier places. So it wants to go from wet to dry. And so what happens is that moisture used to be able to escape our homes very easily through leaky windows and doors and walls. Well, now it can't do that. And so where does that moisture go? Well, it ends up being carried with convective airflow, which you know as warm air rises. The warm air holds the moisture and rises up through the house. Lo and behold, where does it end up? It ends up in the attic. And of course, the risk there is if it ends up in that attic and it gets stuck there and it gets cool at night, the roof deck cools down, whatever is up there cools down, then that warm, moist air is forced to shrink and in essence and ends up condensing and forming droplets of condensation. So that's kind of what happens. But I think the thing that's really important as you as a contractor or an architect think about condensation is it's important to have these discussions with your clients. Again, clients are seeing things on 60 Minutes. They're hearing about the horrors of mold. They're seeing health risk stories. They may have even experienced some folks in their family who have severe reactions to mold. So, it's something that they are thinking about. So again, you as a contractor or an architect who actually can talk to them about that, you create for yourself a competitive advantage that really puts you apart from the crowd by helping your clients understand the real risks that they face from having a situation that may create condensation and eventual mold. So here are just some basics to cover with your clients. Again, you got to help them understand that this condensation is from moisture that originates inside the home. Most of the times when I'm speaking to the average Joe out there and you talk about condensation, for some reason they think about dew on their grass when they get up in the morning, and they think about outside ambient moisture levels, and they think that is the contributing factor to condensation they may get in their attic. In fact, they may even ask you, why do I have all these vents in my attic? Isn't that putting me at risk of condensation in my attic? And they don't realize that the higher moisture levels are actually inside the living space. So you got to have that conversation with them. You have to talk to them about the basics of ventilation, which basically are to let air into your attic, which is fresh air from the outside, and then let it circulate through the attic, carried by convective airflow, and exhaust out at the top. As it goes through the attic and exhausts out at the top, it's going to pick up the moisture that's in the attic and it's going to carry it out right out with it. So the ways, of course, some of the ways to avoid this condensation, one of them is ventilation. Another one is insulation on top of the ceilings. The more we can put insulation on top of the ceilings, then the more we hold that heat inside the living space. And that also then that warm air keeps the moisture in the living space as well, rather than letting it migrate to the colder areas of the attic where it can condense. Vapor barriers are used in many areas of the country. That's typically a continuous polyethylene sheet, which would be behind the drywall on the ceiling or the walls of a home. And that again is to act as a stop to not allow moisture to pass. So that's another method of control. Vapor barriers, of course, are never complete because you've always got penetrations through them and you're putting screws through them when you put your drywall up and all that type of stuff, but they're still helpful. Air sealing. So if you think about can lights in your ceiling, you think about any light fixture, you think about chases for skylights or even chimneys, anything that goes up through your ceiling. A lot of doing good sealing around that from the attic side, just with cans of spray foam helps to keep that air from rushing up through those cracks and ending up in the attic and carrying moisture with it at the same time. In general, closed cell spray foam, and This is kind of a whole different beast. And when we're in Tampa, I'll dig into this a little bit more in depth, but we hear a lot about, spray foamed attics and closed cell spray foam, and it acts as a vapor barrier, so moisture can't get through it. So spray foaming the inside of an attic with closed cell foam is a great way to prevent condensation, because the foam has good R value and moisture also can't get through it. Now, there are some potential drawbacks to it, but as a general rule, it does work well. And so when you hear of homes that are being completely foamed with hot roofs, hot attics, conditioned attics, those are typically good ways to avoid condensation as well. Finally, well, I'll say a couple things. So inside of the home, if they are experiencing condensation problems, obviously dehumidification is an option. But just keeping that air stirred up in the living space, such as by running ceiling fans, making sure that the HVAC system, the little switch for the fan is on rather than auto, so that it's running all the time. Because the more we can keep that air stirred up, then the more we're dispersing that water vapor throughout the air, and again, discouraging it from rising up into the attic where it will condense. Another option on homes where maybe there's very limited ventilation. Again, we're going to talk more about that, but let's say there's very limited ventilation. We're concerned about the moisture migration into the attic. Using an oil-based paint on the ceilings is actually a decent vapor barrier also, compared to a water-based paint, which allows water vapor to pass right through it. And oil-based paint gives a decent barrier to water vapor. So that can be another strategy sometimes to help avoid condensation in an attic. So big question, and I hear this a lot. Don't those metal roofs sweat? And so that's a common question, the big question, as I'm saying. The simple answer is, of course, metal roofs do not sweat because they do not have sweat glands. So they can't sweat. They don't really sweat. The moisture, again, is moisture coming from someplace else, which in almost all cases is the living space, hitting the cold metal and then condensing. So even though metal doesn't sweat, it doesn't have sweat glands, metal is a very non-porous surface. It transmits heat and cold very efficiently, very quickly. And as a result, it generally tends to be one of the cooler surfaces in any sort of assembly. So that makes a metal roof or a metal panel an ideal spot for condensation to occur. So the reason for my camel in this picture is that sometimes a metal roof can be what I call the straw that breaks the camel's back and causes condensation where condensation did not previously occur. So let me just explain that a tiny bit. So you have a house that maybe has not the best ventilation, but it's had enough to get by. So they've never really had any major problems with condensation. Suddenly you put a metal roof on top, and now that roof deck is maybe 10, 15 degrees cooler at night than it used to be, especially earlier in the evening, it gets cooler. And now all of a sudden that metal roof has been something that has caused condensation in that attic where it never occurred before. And so the way I look at that, before the metal roof, they were right on the cusp of having problems. As soon as the metal roof went on, now they suddenly did indeed have problems. So it becomes the proverbial straw breaking the camel's back. So when you approach a house or you approach a new client, I encourage contractors to determine the CLF, the condensation likelihood factor of every structure you work with. Now, don't go Googling CLF. It's something I entirely made up, but I kind of like it. And it's a good, easy way to remember, as you approach every house, think about the condensation likelihood factor. How likely is this structure to have condensation issues? So you want to start out to do that by there's several things you can do. First is to take a look at their current ventilation. How much ventilation is there and is it functioning? So good ventilation, of course, as this diagram shows, is going to be bringing fresh air from the outside in up through the soffit overhangs. It's going to be exhausting that. Here you see some insulation baffles there to keep that air flowing along the underside of the roof deck. And then it's going to exhaust it out at the top. As it travels through the attic, it picks up other moisture in the attic. You also then, as it approaches the ridge vent, you get a Venturi effect where it kind of starts to suck that air out, and it builds up some momentum to also help pull the moisture out. So you want to analyze and take a look at their current ventilation situation. And then you also got to say, okay, you got vents up there, are they working? And one of the things that commonly happens in houses and other buildings is, we have these soffit vents when the structure is built that are to act as intake vents. But then over the years, we go up and we spray insulation up in the attic, and maybe that insulation settles or it gets some moisture in it, it's less effective. We spray more insulation in. We spray more insulation in, and suddenly we have even sprayed insulation into the overhangs, and now those soffit vents are completely blocked. So for you as a contractor on a retrofit or a re-roof job, cleaning out their soffit vents can be a great profit center for you, and you have pointed something out to them that was putting their home at significant risk. And then, of course, turn it into something that you can help them out with by cleaning out those soffit vents and pick up some extra profit as well. So the big question is here, we talk about ventilation, we talk about how it will carry that moisture out of the attic. What is the general recommendation, excuse me, on ventilation? The most common recommendation on attic ventilation is what is called the 1 to 150 ratio. This means 1 square foot of NFA, which is net free area ventilation, for every 150 square feet of attic floor space. So if you look at any ventilation product, whether that's a soffit intake vent or an attic exhaust vent, you're going to see it's going to have an NFA rating. So it may tell you, for example, on a ridge vent, for every foot of ridge vent, you're getting this much NFA. And again, what you're looking for here is 1 square foot, 144 square inches of NFA for every 150 square feet of attic floor. So if you have a 1,500 square foot home, you need at least 10 square feet of NFA in your ventilation. Now, your ventilation, though, that 1 square foot is going to be evenly split between intake vents and exhaust vents. So you're generally looking for a 50-50 split, which is perfect. You're bringing in the same amount of air that you're putting out. If anything, you're going to want that to be a little bit heavier on intake, which creates a little bit of a pressurized system, which even increases that Venturi effect that's going to be sucking air out at the ridge. But you don't want to go to too much of an imbalance. But if you have any imbalance at all, you want it to be on the side of the attic being slightly pressurized. Now, other things that you may do, such as the spray foam, could completely eliminate the need for that ventilation. But things like the vapor barriers behind the drywall we talked about, a very high volume attic. So if you've got a very tall attic where you simply have more air volume, those things can also reduce the amount of ventilation that you need in order for that home to be healthy and functioning properly. And so the bare minimum that everyone in the industry and also the building codes talk about in terms of amount of ventilation is a 1 to 300 ratio. So that would be 1 square foot of NFA for every 300 square feet of attic floor space. But in order for it to be successful at the 1 to 300 ratio, you got to have other things working well. You got to have the vapor barrier, probably a high volume attic. So, you know, I get a lot of people who have modular homes, manufactured homes, and they got condensation problems. Well, most of those have a 212 roof pitch. So there is almost no air volume in that attic. And so in that case, you know, we're going to strive even maybe for a 1:100 ratio because we're going to want as much ventilation as we can possibly get in there because of the very, very tight airspace and the potential there for, so that small home with the tight airspace on the attic, they got the same stuff going on inside of that house as the people with a 10,000 square foot home do in terms of cooking and bathing and laundry and things that create moisture, but they have a whole lot lower space for that moisture to be dispersed. And so a much greater likelihood of condensation occurring. So we got a question. I'm going to take a quick look and see if that's something we can address now. What about two-way vents? So on a two-way vent, I assume you're talking about a vent that both brings in fresh air and exhausts out air. If you want to follow up on that and give me a little bit more of an example of what you're thinking of there, I'll be happy to address that. But I am going to touch on something else here real quick about two-way, or about vents that aren't functioning properly that may start to do the wrong thing. So let's look here at this slide, which talks about improper ventilation risks, the risk of improper ventilation. So if you have both too little intake and too little exhaust venting, you're going to end up with moisture building up in the attic. It's going to lead to condensation. The other thing that moisture in the attic leads to is it makes the insulation be very damp. Well, damp insulation is very ineffective insulation. You want your insulation to be fluffy and buoyant. As soon as it fills up with moisture, it is much less effective. So the general rule of thumb that is usually used is that for every 1% of increase in moisture content in an insulation product, there is a 2.5% decline in the insulation R value. So for example, if I have insulation that has 20% moisture content, I now have dropped the R value of that insulation by 20 times 2.5 by 50%. And so you can see how that becomes, what shall I say, self-perpetuating. It just kind of expands on itself. So we start getting some moisture in the attic, the insulation fills up, it becomes less effective. That lets more warm air carrying moisture from the living space into the attic, and it just starts to snowball. So what's the risk if you have too much intake? Now, remember I mentioned earlier, when you're setting up that balance between intake and exhaust, you generally want it to be 50-50 or maybe slightly more intake. Well, if you have a lot more intake, that can lead to collapsed ceilings in the event of a serious wind event, such as a hurricane. I remember a number of years ago, I was in Florida after one of the hurricanes, and I was with a contractor going through a neighborhood, and there was some damage. But the thing that was really obvious as we drove past these houses was you could see in the windows, all the ceilings had collapsed in these homes. And of course, if you've ever been in a house where the ceiling collapsed, you know that's a mess because it carries insulation and wiring and everything imaginable with it. So these homes were literally almost destroyed by the ceilings collapse. And I asked the contractor, I said, what's going on here? He said, well, they had a lot of soffit vents on these houses and not nearly enough roof exhaust vent. So when the hurricane came through, all this air rushed into the soffits, filled up the attic, and pushed the ceiling down. And it was house after house. Now, these houses had tile roofs on them, so they had very heavy tile roofs on them. A lot of times, if you've got a lower weight roof system on, that sort of pressurization actually will blow the decking off, and we'll see that happen a lot. But in this case, because of the tile roofs, the roof didn't come off, but the ceilings all collapsed. So that's a risk if you have too much intake vent. If you have too much exhaust vent, and this kind of goes back to an inadvertent two-way vent, but if you have too much exhaust vent, what will happen is that vent wants to pull air from someplace. So it will literally start to pull air in part of the vent and exhaust it out the other part, which does several things. First of all, it does nothing for air exchange inside the attic because air just follows the most direct route and it's just going straight in one side, straight out the other, not doing any circulation through the attic cavity itself. But further of all, of course, if you've got a intake vent, or excuse me, an exhaust vent up on the roof, you really don't want to be carrying weather into it because that's going to carry rain and snow and all kinds of stuff in the attic that you don't want. So that's the risk if you have too much exhaust, is it actually starts to act as an intake vent. Now, the other thing that can happen if you get too much exhaust and you still have some intake vent, the whole venting can start to work backward and you can start to draw air in at the top and exhaust it out through the soffits. A real risk there is, first of all, you're not taking advantage of convective airflow, but you're also then forcing all this moisture down into the insulation, which is making the insulation even less effective at that point. So anyway, that's the risk if you have too much exhaust venting. And in general, inadequate ventilation is going to cause higher energy bills because we're not getting the hot air out of the attic. So it's increasing the energy bills in the summer. And of course, for folks up north, inadequate ventilation leads to ice dams on the roof in the winter. Ice dams are the result of heat escaping from the living space, rising up into the attic, warming the underside of the roof deck, causing that snow to melt. That melted snow then trickles down the roof until it hits the cold overhangs, where it refreezes and it forms ice dams that start at the bottom of the roof and gradually creep up the roof and cause a lot of havoc. You know, the problem, of course, then with the rooftop ice dams is, you know, or excuse me, the answer to that is having good attic ventilation so that when that heat escapes the living space, then the attic ventilation comes in and carries it right back out to the outside through the ridge vent or whatever type of venting is at the top. And so there's positives and a lot of reasons for having good attic ventilation. So I encourage you again, the person asked about two-way vents. If you get a chance, put a note on there. Let me know a little bit more about what you're talking about there and see what I can do. As a contractor and you're approaching a house and you're looking at the condensation situation and you know, the condensation potential, I do suggest having a protimeter, which is a moisture meter. A moisture meter would allow you to go up into the attic and to check moisture levels both in the lumber and the insulation and other building materials in the attic. Very simple device, I think are 125 bucks. You want to try to get into the attic areas and check the areas of the attic where there seems to be the least airflow, which are going to be the areas probably where moisture is going to collect the most. And you're checking moisture levels. So you want to look for ideally a moisture level of 10% or less. Certainly if you're getting numbers of 15% or higher, there is an environment in that attic that is ripe for biological growth. And so you have to be concerned at that point when you're seeing those kind of moisture levels. You got to be concerned about helping those homeowners or that property owner find a solution to their problem. Another thing you can also do during your attic inspection is I encourage people to have a smoke pen. So a smoke pen is just a small device that lets off a puff of smoke, and you can then watch how that smoke trails to see if there really is decent airflow through the attic. Make sure the air is going up so the smoke goes up. If the smoke starts to go down, you got a real problem because that ventilation is working backward. But, just allows you to track. The key on using a smoke pen, though, is you've got to have your attic hatch closed because it is artificially, when that attic hatch is opening, it is artificially altering how air is flowing through that attic. So you got to close the hatch, have a flashlight, use your smoke pen, and track and see how the air is flowing. Another thing, as you approach a house, may seem kind of silly, but I always have to work a dog picture into things, but you want to make sure you do a sniff test. Most houses, if there is a serious mold problem or mildew problem or humidity problem, you smell it. So, let your nose kind of lead the way. If you smell it, then you got to start investigating it and try to figure out what's going on. So certainly you want to observe a lot of things when you're working with a property. You want to make sure you're aware that high moisture levels certainly increase the chance of adding a wet metal roof to that structure and that metal roof having condensation issues. If there are already high moisture levels, again, back to that whole straw that breaks the camel's back thing. So you want to check the attic and the living space for current mold, mildew situations, as well as high moisture levels. If you start to pick up on problems, look at things like behind closets, behind furniture, for mold and mildew if you suspect anything. So remember I talked earlier a little bit about what could happen if you have too much exhaust vent in the attic and not enough intake. Well, several years ago, I was called out to a house. They had put a new roof on and everything was fine with the roof, but now they were getting mildew and condensation on their inside walls, especially behind things like furniture and I should say they're outside walls, but inside the house. But like furniture that was against outside walls in their home, the walls had completely mildewed behind them. And, they were trying to figure out what was going on. And so I get there and I start looking around and noodling on stuff a little bit. And it was a very old farmhouse. It was a brick farmhouse, which is a little bit unusual. And the brick was very, very porous. Well, when they put the roof on the house, they had put lots of great exhaust vents on the roof that were creating nice venturi effect, trying to suck air out of the attic. But the attic had no intake vents whatsoever, no soffit vents, nothing. And so what was happening was those attic vents, the exhaust vents, were starved for air. They were trying to pull air from every place they could. And they were literally pulling air in through the loose side walls of the home, which was pulling moisture in through those walls that was then getting trapped behind the furniture that was leading to the mildew and the mold and the condensation problems behind the furniture on their outside walls. And, one of the dead giveaways as I looked at that house was we go up into the attic and we open up the attic hatch and it's just a huge whooshing sound, and you could feel the air rushing up into that attic. And, I knew immediately that, you're pulling air out of the living space, which is pulling it in through the loose walls, which is bringing moisture in and leading to the mildew and problems. So you want to be observant of things like that. Obviously, if there are water problems in the basement or crawl space, that increases the ambient moisture inside the home, which increases the chances of condensation in the attic. If there are any current roof leaks, if they have an exposed fastener metal roof and the fasteners are starting to leak a little bit, those things are all introducing moisture into the attic that in essence, again, just starts to snowball, because as soon as we let more moisture into that attic from outside sources, and by outside sources, I mean sources other than the living space, well, now we've even created a worse situation where you're going to have higher moisture levels in that attic and you're going to have greater chance of condensation. Are there major moisture producers in the house? House plants, mentioned earlier, ventless gas stoves, kilns. I was in a house once with some major problems. It was an SIP panel house, structural insulated panel. The panels were completely rotted out at the ridge. They hadn't been sealed well, but the other problem was he was operating a non-vented ceramic kiln inside of his house. And so the ceramic kiln was just putting off huge amounts of water vapor into the structure, which was then migrating up to the peak and condensing in the SIP panels and rotting them out. Our laundry, bathroom, kitchen vents and fans are those directed outside. Don't ever put a roof on if those things are not directed outside. Again, it's your responsibility as an expert contractor to tell that homeowner, I'm not going to do something that's going to cause you problems. Yes, it's going to cost us a little bit of money to bring that pipe through the roof, but it has to be done. And heaven forbid, don't be the contractor who says, I can just cut all those things off in the attic. You'll be fine. Yeah, don't do that. So as you have looked at a house and you have started to examine it and figure out its current situation, you're going to ask yourself three things. Are things here okay? On the other hand, are there things I need to recommend to this homeowner that there are things they need to improve? And then you got to ask yourself, are these deal breakers if they don't do these things? So if they don't let me unblock the insulation from their intake vents, is that a deal breaker? Do I not want a part of this house if they don't let me do that? Again, the stakes are high for them, but also for you if you create a situation that leads to condensation and mold. And on the other hand, you got to ask yourself sometimes, am I in a situation here that I just want to run for the hills? I don't want to be a part of this project. And, you know, I think everyone's had projects before where you later said, I wish I wouldn't have done that one. That was the gift that kept on giving. So sometimes you got to ask yourself that. And certainly condensation and mold potential are things you don't want to mess with. And so if it's a bad situation, the homeowner is not willing to invest to make it better, it's probably better for you to take a pass and go on to your next successful and profitable project, right? So you can then present solutions if there are solutions to offer, and that allows you to differentiate yourself. Homeowners do not want to go down a road of putting something on their house and having problems. So if you can show them that, hey, if you don't do these things, you're going to be at high risk of mold and problems, you have made yourself the expert and you have given yourself a significant competitive edge. So are there things that you can do? Can you add ventilation? Can you put in better ventilation? As we talked about, can you clear insulation away from their intake vents? And then finally, another thing is, can you make sure that their fans and exhausts and things like that are all vented to the outside and not simply venting into the attic? So brings us to the next question, you know, how are you going to build this roof and what is that going to look like? Big question I hear a lot with metal roofing, and metal roofing certainly has the benefit that it can be a structural product. It doesn't, a lot of products don't have to have decking underneath of them. But I can't stress enough, my advice is very strong. For smaller structures, which includes all residences, even the 12,000 square foot residence, the exposed underside of a metal roof in the attic is just an invitation to condensation. And you do not want to be the contractor that did that. So here you see photos of an attic where they put a panel right on top of horizontal purlins. And of course, it's literally raining in these people's attic. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, well, I was in on the job the other day, Todd, and they had an old metal roof, been up there for 50 years, and it doesn't have decking, and it's been fine. Correct. I believe that and understand that. But what happens when the next homeowner replaces all the windows, The next homeowner puts house wrap on, puts fan fold on, puts siding on. The next homeowner starts putting more house plants in the house or adds a ventless gas stove. What happens when those things are done? And now suddenly we're back to the straw that breaks the camel's back. And now suddenly you've got condensation in condensations where in situations where condensation did not occur before. So decking is highly recommended for smaller structures as well as residences. I want to go back again to my proverbial camel and the straw that breaks his back. Metal roofs that have a lot of metal to roof deck contact. So this would be standing seam, it would be exposed fastener products. Those products drop the temperature of that roof deck through conduction. So this is the situation where a metal roof can be the straw that breaks the camel's back and can suddenly cause condensation that didn't occur before, because now that roof deck temperature is cooler than it was before, and you end up with condensation. So answers to that, putting your standing seam or your exposed fastener panel up on purlins, getting it off the roof deck helps to create a thermal break between the metal and the roof deck. So that keeps that roof deck from getting as cold. And so that can help reduce the chance of condensation. Thermal break, same thing as a thermal pane window. You've all seen demos of thermal pane windows, double pane of glass. I put a heat bulb behind a single pane of glass and I feel all the heat coming through. I put a heat bulb behind a double pane of glass. I suddenly don't feel the heat. That is the benefit of a thermal break. And so that's what we can actually do on the roof by getting that metal up off the roof deck. We can keep that roof deck from getting as cold from the metal. Interesting thing, and you see a photo here of a metal shingle roof. Metal shingles actually have an inherent thermal break because of the way they are formed. The metal, for the most part, is up off the roof deck, and so they inherently have a thermal break. So over the years, I've been called in on a lot of projects where they put on standing seam or they put on exposed fastener and suddenly had condensation problems they didn't have before. And it all goes back to what we're talking about here. But I've never been in a situation on a metal shingle roof where that happened. Can't say it will never happen. It might. You might have a situation where it does, but it doesn't take a huge thermal break to break that thermal bridge and to keep from passing that cooler temperature down to the roof deck. So there are some things you can do with underlayment options. In extreme situations of limited ventilation in an attic, underlayment can play a role. Ice and water shield on the entire roof is generally not a good idea unless you have really, really good ventilation and hopefully a vapor barrier to boot. And I run into this. So I'll run into contractors who have never put up metal before, and they say, well, I've never put up metal before, but it'll be okay. I'm going to put ice and water shield on the whole thing. No water's going to get through that. Well, they have just sealed that house up like a terrarium, if you will. And so if there were any inclination toward a lack of ventilation before or potential for condensation, and now I put ice and water shield on it, I really have become, my infamous straw that breaks the camel's back. Standard synthetic underlayments really don't breathe much, but they do breathe through the laps. So they're certainly much, much preferable to ice and water shield on the entire roof. There are breathable synthetics available. You want to check the perm rating. Some of the breathables out there are better than others in terms of having a higher perm rating. Again, we're never going to breathe through the roof deck. That's not the intention here, folks. You still got to have good ventilation. But if you have a situation where ventilation is just really limited and you're desperate for anything, then a breathable underlayment is certainly better than a non-breathable. The other thing that you can do is you can create a drainage plane. So you can put cross battening, you can put vertical battens up first, horizontal battens or new decking, and then your roof. Or you could use an entangled mesh product like cedar breather or Incamat or Dry Tech. Those entangled mesh products basically are just to create a spacer to get that metal up off the roof deck, which creates a drainage plane. So if let's say you put a breathable underlayment up there, moisture comes out through the breathable underlayment, hits that space you've created by your purlins or by your entangled mesh. It condenses and it is free then to roll down the roof and exit at the bottom. Another option, of course, is a cold roof. So a cold roof combines vertical battens with an additional layer of decking, and you vent the whole thing. So you actually do above sheathing ventilation on top of the existing sheathing. So here you see a couple photos. The lower left is an image of the entangled mesh product. The upper right is an image of a cold roof being built on a house. Interesting thing I want to point out here, if you look there below the skylights, you see that they have left their sleepers open there. So they are venting, bringing air in at the bottom edge of that cold roof down at the fascia. If that air comes up and it hits the skylight chase, it then can travel horizontally, laterally to reach one of the vertical chambers again, and again be exhausted out at the ridge. So that's a cold roof assembly. So other impacts of proper ventilation, a metal roof, obviously, as we touched on, can help to minimize heat gain into the attic. And then you have proper ventilation to carry out any heat that is gained. So, you know, that can save significantly on someone's cooling costs in the summer and help a great deal with energy efficiency. Also, proper ventilation is usually a key answer to preventing ice dams on a roof as well, simply by getting that hot air that comes up out of the structure back to the outside before it melts the snow and causes the whole process that leads to ice dams. So we have covered a lot. I'm going to see if we have any other questions up here. Don't have any other questions. If there are other questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them now. I'd love to hear from any of you too as to whether this was helpful or not. As I think about and plan toward the MetalCon presentation, if you think of something that, gosh, Todd, I wish you would have talked about that, let me know what that is, and I will talk about that at MetalCon as well, because I want to be as effective and as helpful as it possibly can be, both for architects and contractors out there. I am going to go one more slide. I hope this is okay. I did put my email address up there. You're welcome to email with me with any problems or questions or situations you might run into. Even if you have a homeowner that you're trying to convince, hey, there's a potential problem here, give me a call. Let's get on the phone together. I'm happy to talk it through with them. And my interest more than anything is making sure that people make good decisions that are follow building science and decisions that are right for them in their homes or other structures. Oh, we might have another question here. Let me look. Could you speak a little more about heating a metal building and the moisture that can be put into the building by using propane, natural gas versus other heating sources? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can talk directly to that situation, Gary. That's not a world that I typically live in, but same things apply. You know, warm, moist air on a cold surface is going to condense. And so if you're watching those air levels, the moisture levels inside the building, I mean, you know, anytime you're seeing ambient moisture inside a building of, 30% or more, that's pretty high. And so that's the time to think about dehumidification, maybe an air makeup unit. something in order to get that moisture level down a little bit. But then beyond that, you're thinking about, okay, how's that moisture going to travel through the structure? Is it going to end up in the attic? Is there any way that I can keep it out of the attic? Is there any way I can keep it from reaching a cold surface once it is in the attic? So just got to kind of think through the basic principles. Happy, if you want to give me a call anytime, I'd be happy to talk it through in more detail too. Again, you're kind of in a sandbox there I'm not normally in, but I think the same basic principles apply. Any other questions?
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, then I am happy to say thank you so much again, Todd. We so appreciate you joining us on MetalCon Live today. And we look forward to seeing you in just a few short months, 2 months. Can anyone believe that? 2 months away from MetalCon. Again, we so appreciate your time. Everyone who attended today, thank you so much for being here with us. You will be receiving a survey very shortly, and that will allow you to get your AIA continuing education credits, along with any certificates you may need for private bodies or for other governing bodies for continuing education credits. Again, we thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you again, Todd. We will see you all hopefully in October. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Take care.